today's episode of The Story Detective, we are going to cover Act 2 of Save the Cat. Now, Act 2 has 7 beats as opposed to the 5 beats in Act 1. We also are going to be comparing Save the Cat with a different type of story structure. Last time we did a little comparison with the hero's journey. This time we're going to have a bit of a comparison with Story Engineering by Larry Brooks. We're also going to move along with our villains aspect of this series, and this time around we're going to cover psychotic villains, those kinds of villains that we think of as irremediable monsters, like the Joker, and most serial killers would fall into this pattern as well. That's what's coming up today. We have a lot to cover, so let's roll that intro footage. Act 2 is what we discussed as a crossing of the threshold. In Star Wars, it's when Luke Skywalker leaves the planet. He's literally crossing the threshold from his home planet, moving into space in a ship going to places he always dreamed about but never thought he would see, and also under circumstances that he never imagined. Crossing that threshold in Save the Cat is called Break into Two. The antithesis of Act 1, they refer to it as the upside down world, because whatever the status quo of your hero was in Act 1 in their normal life, once they get to that point, all that is going to be turned upside down. Remember back in Act 1 when they were offered the challenge and they refused because they weren't ready? Well, at this point in your story, they're ready. They are now committed. And like any other commitment, it's important. It's what they're all about. It's what in their heart of hearts has motivated them from the beginning, but now they're left with no choice. They're usually pulled into this action by circumstances beyond their control, but once they cross the threshold, it's not exactly what they expected. In Story Engineering, for example, this happens between 20 and 25%. In Save the Cat, they have it at the 20% mark. It's basically the same thing, but Story Engineering phrases it as plot point 1. And they tell you when you get to this point, this is when your character meets that insurmountable, life-changing problem that nothing is the same. It could be something happening that upends their life, whether they're responsible for it or whether someone they know is responsible for it, aka the villain, and their life is not the same. It's both motivating and intimidating at the same time, because while they've accepted the challenge, they're still not ready for what's going to happen at this point. There's still challenges to overcome, and they have all of those inner demons, that stuff that's inside that they haven't dealt with yet, that's going to get in the way. Your hero is uninformed at this point. They're still making bad decisions or the wrong decisions, trying to fix things in the wrong way. If something bad happens in life, usually you're reacting to it first. And Story Engineering points out very clearly that everything after that big moment when they cross the threshold is a reaction of plot point 1. And you understand when something bad happens in your life unexpectedly, your first reaction is to try to make the problem go away. You try to fix things. You look for quick fixes. You don't want the problem. You're not educated enough to deal with the problem, especially if it's big enough to be a life-changing problem, but you're trying to make it disappear as quickly as it appeared. Psychotic villains. How do they see themselves? How does their wounds, or their shards of glass, affect their belief system, their morality? They prey on people as if they were dolls to be played with. They can shift their personality, even opt for changes in their physical appearance to blend in. Some even believe they are ridding society of vermin. Many are considered to be unprofilable because of their unpredictability, often adaptable nature. And yet, as writers, we still need to have a foundation for such characters, if they are to be believable, credible enough for readers to suspend their disbelief. What was the path which led them into darkness? We imagine it must have been something pretty horrible, and sometimes it can be. Other times it might not be as terrifying as the monsters they eventually become. This is because the human brain produces a stew of hundreds of chemicals. How they affect us from person to person varies, which is why you'll find villains like Voldemort, who some have said doesn't seem altogether viable because thousands of people may have suffered as a child and haven't become evil. The circumstances, the origins of the psychosis, is not as important as the result, because one bad thing often leads to another. We might bang our toe getting out of bed, putting us in a bad frame of mind, which makes our entire day spiral. This is the life of most psychotic villains. Whatever events made the first domino topple it became a chain of events throughout their lives. That's not to say their pre-existing wound or shard of glass isn't important. Let's take a closer look. And beat number 2 is called B story, and it relates to that internal problem or internal theme of your story. The B story introduces a character that's usually representative of those internal problems your hero has. It could be a love interest, it could be a new friend, it could be a mentor if they haven't met one already. Now again, let's look at Star Wars. By the time we get to this beat, we have several characters that help Luke Skywalker break out of his shell. There's Han Solo, and then there's the mentor character in Obi-Wan Kenobi, and all of those relationships are taken to a different place. They're also trying to teach Luke something. This character is usually someone who is a product of crossing that threshold or this new upside down world that they find themselves in, because you're meeting this character because they're not part of the status quo. They may come out of left field, or it could even be an old friend that could be known to them, but maybe they haven't seen in a while. If you're starting a new job, who's the first person that you meet that you connect with that sort of guides you into that world of starting that new position? Same thing here. This is what the B story character does. It helps to guide them. It helps them to learn something about themselves if they're paying attention. The pre-existing wound usually happens early in life and involves some type of abuse. The dark seed is planted very deeply and usually left to fester. If it's caused by a parent or guardian, often it can seem as if there's no recourse. No one is coming to their rescue, and in the mind of a child or abuse victim, telling means that it would expose their secret, or maybe get them in trouble. So this shard is buried away in their mental closet. The seed that was planted grows in darkness, becoming a tangled morass. Even what might appear to be a relatively small problem at first can grow because it's personal. It also gets steeped in that person's stew of chemicals. It's pretty common knowledge these days that depression feeds in isolation, and such emotions often make the victim turn away from people in general. They feel different, or that no one cares. Multiply that by a lifetime of dominoes falling, rage building, emotions repressed. For psychotic villains, fictional and in real life, there often comes what we writers might call an inciting incident, and aptly put, because it changes everything. This should be a character that shares some of your hero's flaws, only in a more exaggerated way. Again, looking at Star Wars, this is Han Solo. He represents to Luke Skywalker, who's always wanted his freedom, that act of totally being free and doing whatever he wants. So his freedom is an exaggerated version of Luke Skywalker's freedom. As Save the Cat points out, it's like holding up a mirror to your hero's flaws, but giving him a reflection in such an exaggerated way. The hero may not like what they see. They often have problems with this character. The idea of Han Solo, they had their differences and they had their best friend kind of thing. It was like a brother. It was like that intimate reflection and offshoot. And this is what I said before. All of the characters that you create as your cast are a direct reflection of some part, some facet of your hero. The inciting incident is the discovery of an outlet for all that repressed emotion. It's when they cross the line, and it unlocks the mental door where the shard has been locked away. And what usually pours out is anger in the form of that tangled morass, and it takes the shape of violence. They've discovered the proverbial monster in the closet is real, and they essentially embrace it, because giving that monster free rein is akin to finding a purpose. Some serial killers have expressed this as their greatest passion, their only thrill. Others feel like they are finally avenging whatever wrongs were done to them, or society. They feel they are delivering justice. And whatever the original shard was, the type of wound that originally hurt them will dictate the avenue they take, and often the type of victims they pursue. Beat 3 of Act 2 is called Fun and Games. This is supposed to be the part of the book that is the promise of the premise. Now what that means is whatever your premise is, and Save the Cat talks about the Martian as a man who's stranded on Mars and trying to survive, this is where that main premise theme comes in. We are shown the character trying to survive in that upside down world, or whatever the problem is that they're reacting to. It's not always fun and games because sometimes it's reacting very badly. It's fun and games for the reader. It may not be so much fun and games for your hero because this is where they're tested. This is where the ultimate test of that character comes in and where they end up getting in their own way. In Star Wars, Luke Skywalker goes with his mentor and his newfound friend Han Solo, and they try to rescue Princess Leia. And look what happens there. They're shot at by stormtroopers. They get caught in a garbage disposal. They end up having a lot of sequences where they attempt to succeed in their mission. And even though they succeed in a part of it, there's a much bigger part that even if they have their small victories, ultimately what they end up with is a lot more problems to solve. And that's what happens when we panic and try to make things go away. Psychologically, we only exhaust ourselves. And we exhaust ourselves by trying this, trying that. We're not resolving the problem by reacting, and neither does your hero. The Joker is one of the most popular psychotic villains. In comics, possibly the most popular version of his origins was written by Alan Moore in The Killing Joke. We never see what causes his shard, but we see a disturbed, self-centered individual who gets involved with criminals because he needs money. This leads to his wife getting murdered when he is reluctant to cooperate. And yet, after this devastating blow, this seemingly frail individual still manages to help them. He ends up taking the fall, which leads to him becoming the Joker. This personality type, however, is often intrigued by crime, and his wife was the one thing that stood in his way, tried to convince him to give up his pursuit of being a stand-up comic since she was pregnant and finances were bleak. He's shown to turn on her at one point for mentioning this. He's sorry in the next minute, but shortly thereafter she ends up dead. Was this all just a coincidence? Or was it his inciting incident when he begins to embrace the monster? I haven't seen the new movie, but heard it showed a lot of dominoes falling, gaining empathy for the character. This part of the story that began around the 20 to 25% mark, depending on which form of structure you decide to use, continues right up to the 50% mark when you reach the midpoint. So all of this fun and games aspect of it takes up a relatively large chunk of your story. It's nearly a quarter of it. You're developing the characters in the new world. You can introduce new characters here. You're introducing this new status quo of the upside down world while your hero is going through the motions of trying to figure things out. Much like you did in the setup version that showed the status quo, now you're flipping that over in this part of the story and showing the darker side of life for your character as they're struggling, as they're failing, as they're coming up against those challenges. In Star Wars, they were literally coming to meet the dark side of the Force. Technically, that's very symbolic of what happens, and in this quarter of your story leading up to the midpoint. There has been a recent biography series and a movie based on the life of Ted Bundy, one of the more popular serial killers. He was shown to be charming, clever, and compulsive as hell when it came to his secret life. Even when escaping police custody and should have been keeping a low profile, he left a trail of bodies in his wake. He just couldn't stop himself. There's a kind of arrogance involved in this type of character. The same type of arrogance that causes some to connect with certain police officials. It's as if they have something to prove, or maybe they feel they just can't be stopped, but they will often go too far. Sometimes, as portrayed by the Joker and Batman's relationship, the villain needs his other half, his opposing reflection, in order to feel justified. Or maybe they simply need that audience of one who they feel will appreciate their efforts. This might best be summed up in Heath Ledger's performance of the Joker when he tells Batman, "I don't want to kill you, you complete me."